I'm Wendy Gardiner and this is the Craft Academy. I'm going to show you how to insert an invisible or concealed zip. Now these really are my favourite zips of all time, particularly for garments. As you can see, there's no stitching on the outside. That makes it so much easier. And all you can see is the little tab at the top. Now the trick to making these perfectly invisible is to use an invisible zip foot. An invisible zip foot usually has just a little hole in the top. On the underside there is a groove. There's a nice groove for either side of the zip teeth, which are on the underside of the zip, to go through. So if I place the zip in place, the right side of the zip there's no teeth, and on the underside where the teeth are, that's what goes through the groove on the foot. So if I try and place this here to show you, you can see the teeth open out a little, they fit through the groove, and as you sew, you're stitching underneath those teeth so that the fabric edges curl together really closely, concealing it completely. The first thing to do, of course, is to neaten the raw edges of your zip placement place. Pop the zip foot on, and I have already neatened the raw edges using my over-edge foot and an over-edge stitch. I haven't sewn the rest of the seam. You sew the rest of the seam after you've inserted the zip. But I have placed my pieces together so that I can make sure I put the zip in the right way up. First thing to do, lay the zip down so I have my fabric right sides together. I've creased the seam allowance back, so I've now got a nice crease, and that's where I want the teeth to run along. So I'm placing the zip in place, face down, so that it's going to be the right side when it's turned round. Pin it in place just on the seam allowance only. And then I can take away the other piece, because I don't need that now, and undo that zip. And then I turn it so that that is now ready. So the zip is now ready for me to stitch in place. Now I can stitch down the centre with a basting stitch by hand or by machine, or I can just pin it in place. So for speed, I'm just going to pin it in place. So I'm pinning it down with the teeth running along the crease I made earlier when I pressed the seam allowance to the wrong side. Now note, when you're inserting an invisible zip, it's a good idea to buy a zip that's about 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres longer than you would normally, because you can't stitch to the very end. Place it under the foot so that the teeth fit into the groove. So on this side they're going to fit into the right hand groove, and I want to make sure that my needle goes down and it's going to stitch just underneath the teeth. So I've positioned it so that the teeth are running down the right hand groove, and I'm turning the wheel by hand to check. So I'm just checking they're in the right place. I could move the needle a little bit over to the right if I need to by using the stitch width button, but I think I'm okay here. Take the pins out because you don't want to try and stitch over the pins, so I take them out as I go. And as I'm going along, I am opening the teeth a little to help guide it through that groove on the underside of the foot. As you get to the end, you'll see that you can't go to the very end of the zip. So don't worry about that. That's, as I said earlier, buy a zip about 1 inch longer. That's the first side ready. I now need to put the other side in. So again, I'm going to close the zip just to make sure I put the other side in the right way round, because it can look a little bit awkward. And this also makes sure that you've stitched it nice and close and the zip still closes. So it's a sort of double check, really. So I'm putting the other piece of fabric on. Now I've made this hard for myself because it's difficult to tell the right from the wrong side. But as I've pressed the seam allowance over, I know that I've got this right sides together. I can also do another check. Another thing I do is I would double pin to show the wrong side if you had that difficulty of knowing which is which. So again, I'm going to pin in place. I pin the zip tape to the seam allowance only, and having done that, I can open up that zip again so that the zip pull is out of the way, and then continue to pin the zip tape along that crease. And as I said, you can actually you can baste with a machine baste or a hand baste, so you don't need to just leave the pins in. It depends how you like to work. This time when I put it under the machine, the teeth are going to go into the left hand groove on the underside of the foot. So I finished putting the zip in. The next stage is to sew the rest of the seam. So to do that, I'm going to fold it right sides together again, pull the tails out of the way, and pin the remainder of my seam together. Now I'm going to use the regular zip foot to do this, and I'm not going to try and stitch and join up the previous stitching from the zip exactly, because if you do that, you end up getting a little bump at the bottom of the zip. What I'm going to do is stitch about 2 to 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch away from the previous stitching, keeping that zip pull out of the way. I'm putting it under so you can see using this zip foot. Now I can also move my needle across to the right a little bit using my stitch width button, so I can get nice and close to that previous stitching. Go forward a little, back a little, that's locking that stitching in. Keeping that zip pulled out of the way. And the last step is to catch down that little tail that you've got here. And again, on the seam allowance only, just using your zip foot, just catch that down. So seam allowance only, you're stitching that little tail so that it doesn't flap and catch. So I'll tidy all those threads up later. So there I have an invisibly stitched zip. All you can see is a little zip pull and no bump in the seam at the bottom as it continues on. So it really is a lovely, quick way of inserting a zip.